This is TWIT.
Is the newest supercar, the GTX 1660 Ti killer. We mentioned this last week, the new Super. It's so super. Actually, we mocked it. We discussed it. And at this point, Sebastian actually has full-on GTX 1660 Super performance benchmarks.
I do.
It is darn near as fast as a 1660 Ti. It is somewhat faster than, actually significantly faster. I almost want to say, depending on the benchmark, 15 or 20% faster than a 1660.
Right.
What was your overall call on this one after looking at all of the numbers across all of the cards?
Very simply, it's so close to a 1660 Ti that the 1660 Ti's pricing doesn't make any sense anymore. And I say that because we tested, and actually have both these cards here. You cannot tell them apart because these are both MSI cards with the same cooler. It's their twin Frozer 7 cooler. This one right here is the Super, and this is the 1660 Ti. Now, the 1660 Ti that I tested from MSI is a factory overclocked card. So if you look, it's 2, 3, 4 frames per second max difference between these two. And the Ti, the higher end and more expensive Ti, this is a $309 retail version of the card, was just barely ahead. So a stock Ti is going to be even closer. And the lowest, like the entry-level price for the 1660 Ti is $279. This card that I benchmarked, the new 1662 Super, starts at $229, only $10 above the launch price of the regular 1660, the vanilla 1660. And it sits in between the 1660 and the Ti as far as specs go. The big change, and really if you look, if you're comparing on the specs table the 1660 to this new Super, it looks underwhelming because it has exactly the same number of cores. It has exactly the same base and boost clocks. Nothing is different. There's no extra texture units, no additional ROPs, same amount of memory. The difference is they went from GDDR5 to very fast GDDR6. And they went with 14 gigabit per second GDDR6, which is actually faster than the DDR6 that's in the Ti, which is only 12 gigabit per second. So it's interesting. They have pumped up a vanilla 1660 with faster memory than they offer in their Ti, and it has created a situation where there's almost overlap between the two. If you were to get a factory overclocked 1660 Super and compare it to a stock clock Ti, you're going to start to see overlap depending on the game and the resolution if they're already within 2 to 4 frames per second of each other. In this instance, it's puzzling to me that they retained the 1660 and the 1660 Ti out there on the market. They didn't say they were discontinuing either of them, and we asked them specifically when we had the press call with NVIDIA before this launch, and they said no, the 1660 and the Ti are not being discontinued. They're not going anywhere. This is simply creating an additional option, and I'll be curious to see if we see a price drop on the 1660 Ti, because at this point it starts to feel like they almost are going to have a card at every $10 price point when you look at all the partners they have, and there's got to be 100 different 16 series cards between all the different partners combined at this point. I think there were 96 before this launch. So now there's going to be a bunch of GTX 1660 Super cards out there in various states of overclock, where you'll have your 30 megahertz overclock card and your 70 megahertz overclock card and your 85 megahertz overclock card from every vendor. And it's getting very, very condensed. I don't know what the right word is. It's getting more and more confusing to shop because you have to be careful. Are you looking at a 1660, or is that the one with GDDR5? Is the one with GDDR6? You have to look for the Super, or is that the Ti? And maybe that Ti is slower than the overclocked Super. And the price difference between the vanilla and the Super make it a no-brainer to go with the Super, because you're paying $10 more for the performance that you had been paying about $70 or $60 more for. So it's just, this is a fantastic bargain for 1080p gaming. I was testing games at 1080 Ultra, and some of these games are really demanding. If you look at something like Metro Exodus, which is just, it is very tough at 1080p if you have it just at ultra settings, because I mean, the amount of visual detail, the processing that it's doing, it's hard on AMD and NVIDIA cards, but we're under 60 frames per second across the board. And really, this is something where like I test like this simply to try to push the GPU as hard as I can without making the result more CPU dependent. Far Cry 5, much easier to drive, even with the HD textures enabled, even at the Ultra preset. That's a DX11 game, DirectX 11. So, you know, you get very playable frame rates from the 1660 on up, and really the Radeon RX 580 and up. And I had retested this little group of cards with the latest drivers to provide the results we're looking at here if you're watching the video. But, you know, the 1660 gives you an average frame rate in Far Cry 5 at 1080 Ultra with HD textures enabled of 77.2. The Super boosts that all the way up to 95.1, which is 23% higher. And then the TI, an overclocked TI, pushes that a little bit further to 99.1, so 4 frames per second higher. And that was the story pretty much across the board. It doesn't matter which game you were looking at and which resolution, 1080, 1440. There was very little variance between the TI and this new Super in the actual frame rate, in the smoothness. That didn't really change. The 95th and 99th percentile frame times didn't really change. So absolutely, if you're shopping for a card in that $200 range, consider moving up to about $230 to get this new 1660 Super card, because you're getting basically $300 levels of performance. And we haven't seen anything in this price range from AMD yet with the new Navi cards. So we have to wait a little bit longer to see the RX 5500, which is the card that they are going to use to target that like premium 1080p gaming market that NVIDIA is currently kind of sitting alone. They have only these older RX 500 series parts from AMD to compete with on price. But the nice thing about this launch is we've seen prices drop on those RX 500 cards in the last few days. So you can find good deals out there. AMD's offering game bundles. So you can certainly score a bargain while we wait for the RX 5500. But just like with Intel we were talking about before, we have to wait for those high-end desktop parts with the high core counts to really see if AMD's Ryzen can be dethroned in the desktop space. And of course, AMD also has the 3950X coming out by the end of the year. So it's getting really interesting and very competitive on both sides with GPUs and CPUs.